Okay, this is Chapter 3, Colonial Ways of Life. The notes from this slide are from the class notes that I used to use, so feel free to pause the video and write down whatever you see on there if you think it helps you out. Also, the stuff I'll talk about comes from the textbook, is from the previous book, or not the previous book, the current book, excuse me. The shape of early America. Population growth. Once the colonies were established, they grew rapidly. By 1750, there were over 1 million colonists, and in 1775, there were 2.5 million. Ben Franklin saw this as a result of two things. One, there was plentiful land, and it was cheap. And two, labor was scarce and also cheap. So what this caused is an influx of people from Europe. And the opposite in Europe was true. So this drew people to the colonies. Oftentimes, immigrants settled and had large families to help them work alongside them. Seaboard ecology. People lived along the coast. Even today, the majority of population centers are not far from the coast. This will come more into play as we move forward and we look at the types of different colonies. In Virginia, as an example, gentlemen farmers would feel that they were basically English country gentlemen, just albeit way, way out in the country, but still connected to England through what we refer to as a tidewater community. A tidewater community is the idea that you could have all the trappings of England, but live in the colonies. The sort of community of England would come right to your doorstep, or be at your back dock from your plantation. You could order furniture, clothes. There's even companies that would let you order a wife if that was what you wanted. The early shape of America. In the Americas, women married early, about the age of 20. So that gave them more years to bear children. And on average, a colonial woman would have two more children than her European counterpart. Also, thanks to less population density and the bountiful nature of land, people tended to live longer as well. Eventually, the growth of the colonies would cause places like Boston or Philadelphia to have the same level, though, of disease and population density as those in Europe. The role of women in the colonies, this is going to contrast sharply with Spain. And remember, Spain directly controlled their colonies and often from time to time didn't allow women to travel to New Spain, excuse me. And so there was often a lack of women in Spain. So the more women from the British colonies is also a reason why this led to a population growth. And the Europeans in both sets bring with them their patriarchal society, which means the man or father ruled it. And so they marginalized women. And they're often seen as property and not allowed to own property or vote or anything like that. The work done by women, women ran the household. They oftentimes farmed around the house, maybe in a large garden. They were also very self-sustaining, the families in general back then, so they grew their own food, that sort of thing. A woman's day was pretty busy. You'll read about it mostly in your textbook, but they got up early and they had to care for the children. They cared for the animals. They did a lot of sort of handiwork around the house, all that sort of stuff. And, they went to bed around 9. Now, I know that sounds to you like a very early time to go to bed, but realize people went to bed much earlier back in the day because of the lack of light, right? The sun went down. There weren't light bulbs. You had to sit by a candle or oil lamp kind of thing. And so people went to bed much earlier. So 9 would have been relatively late to stay up. And so that was how long it took them to get all their stuff done. In urban areas, the lack of workers led women to learn other trades. Oftentimes, women worked in taverns as tavern keepers or even hostesses, that kind of idea, shopkeepers. And oftentimes, they would also serve as, well, not serve as, but a widower or somebody whose husband passed away, they would carry on oftentimes the business that their husband had. So being a printmaker or a silversmith or something like that. All in all, it was probably better for women in the colonies than in Europe. Puritan laws protected women from abuse and allowed for divorce, all because of their well-ordered family ideal. Even though this is a step in the right direction, we won't see more equality for women until we see more westward expansion, where women were working alongside men, and there seemed to be a necessity for it. Now we're going to move into covering the southern plantations, of which Virginia is the most northern. In this image, you can see a few things. One, you see the country gentleman that I was discussing earlier. He's reclining in his chair, smoking his pipe, having just a good old time. Two, you see the slaves working in the field tending to the tobacco plants. Three, you see the barrels, are oftentimes referred to as hogsheads. Nowadays, a hogshead is more of a measurement for liquor in a barrel, but at this point in time, it was also food commodities, or say things such as tobacco. You can see them lined up, and you can see them ready to get onto the dock or that cutout in that wall right there. Also, you see the ships lined up or sailing, either or, out to sea or coming in to gather the hogsheads and take them back to Europe. We'll look at this a little bit more in class. Society and the economy, it should say in the southern colonies. I guess I didn't edit that properly. But what you need to know is that we're going to talk about the southern colonies first. And in the next presentation, we'll talk about the New England colonies and the middle colonies as well. So, the southern colonies, the crops, thanks to the environment and the growing seasons, the southern colonies were well known for their agriculture. Places like Virginia grew tobacco, South Carolina became known for rice, and North Carolina became known for pine tar, which was used oftentimes used for the shipmaking industry, for sealing boats and all that sort of stuff. It's also where we get the term Tar Heel from. So if you've ever wondered where the University of North Carolina got its mascot from, it became from the production of pine tar during this time period. Now, since everything was agricultural, this meant there was a high demand and necessity for slaves and indentured servants. Right? We will talk more about slavery in class, and you've been assigned the Middle Passage and other readings on slavery. Remember to answer those questions. And also, we've already read a couple articles about indentured servitude. So realize that this wasn't a good situation for most people. Now, since slaves were a necessity, the slave trade was very, very important. And you can see most of the slaves came from West Africa. Now, slaves would then be shipped to the West Indies to work in the sugar plantations. They'd be shipped to Brazil to work in sugar, also Brazil wood, and I believe eventually coffee in Brazil. Same thing with Guyana. And in North America, we will see them working in the cotton fields and tobacco plantations, namely. Society and the economy in the southern colonies continued here. Religion, oftentimes I say the 17th century was the most sort of religious the country ever was, but in the southern colonies, they say that probably only 1 in 15 people were actually members of churches, and Governor Berkeley actually makes Anglicanism the official religion of Virginia. And what that does is that runs off the Puritans and the Quakers, and they go find other places. And realize this is going to be a deep contrast to the other colonies, right? The other colonies wouldn't like Anglicanism. Anglicanism is oftentimes the American term for the Church of England, all right? So they would be definitely against that. Also, just the nature of Anglicanism was different. It was a more collective experience, meaning the group went to church, while Puritanism, congregationalism, all that sort of stuff, tended to emphasize the personal experience. Oftentimes, Puritanism stressed the evilness of people and how angry God was, while Anglicanism oftentimes stressed the goodness of God and His benevolence. As you can see here in the picture, though, we also have the concept of slaves and religion. You can see the guys dancing. One of the interesting things, a little trivia for you, the combination of slaves being shipped from West Africa to places such as Hispaniola, in the West Indies, all that sort of stuff, and then eventually making their way to the Americas, is going to lead to the combination of religions. And so you have African religions being mixed with Christianity and other influences, and that's where we get the terms for and the concept for voodoo, which is just kind of an interesting thing to me anyway. We can talk about this a little bit in class. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to show you the video that comes with the textbook from the author, and it'll talk about the lack of labor in England and how that led to more people coming to the New World.
During the 17th and 18th centuries, the English colonists that were streaming into the American colonies discovered that there was plenty of land, but rarely enough labor to work the land. And the way they adapted to that need was first to use what were called indentured servants. Indentured servants were poor, unemployed young people in Europe who were desperate to get to America, the land of opportunity and the opportunity to own land themselves. And the way they were able to get to America was through signing what were called indentures. Indentures were essentially a labor contract whereby a young person in Europe would sign an indenture promising to work for 3 years or up to 7 years in exchange for an American paying their passage across the Atlantic Ocean to the colonies. So once in America, the indentured servants worked for an American. The American provided housing and tools, and then after their indenture was completed, they were provided with clothes and cash and sometimes land. But even indentured servants were not sufficient to provide the labor needed in the bustling, growing American colonies. And that, unfortunately, led to the practice of slavery. Initially, British colonists enslaved Native Americans. They either did so directly or they purchased Indian slaves from Native Americans who had captured other tribes. So there was a slave trade in Indians. Over time, however, Americans decided that Indians did not make very good slaves, in part because they escaped, in part because they were not willing to work as much or as hard or as long as the American owners wanted. That's what in turn led to the development of African slavery in the American colonies. Professional slavers, as they were called, captured or bought African slaves in Africa and then transported them to the New World. African slaves were especially hardworking. They were captive. They were controlled. They were regulated. They were restricted. So they provided, especially in the southern colonies, the needed source of labor that had been so desperately required by the growing American economy and the profit motive that drove so many American colonists. Buying slaves from Africa may have helped solve the labor shortage in the American colonies, especially the southern colonies, but it created all sorts of problems, both moral, economic, social, and political. It was an inheritance that the American Republic would continue to wrestle with for generations thereafter.